Tomorrow morning, millions of people will wake up and do the same thing. Some will pour a bowl of cereal. Others will fry a couple of eggs. Someone somewhere is already running late and grabbing a piece of toast on the way out the door. A few hours later, lunch. Later still, dinner. It happens so often that it almost fades into the background of everyday life. 3 meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner. Simple enough. Except, who decided that? Not your parents, not your school, not even your country. Somewhere along the way, eating 3 times a day became so ordinary. And that's the strange part. We've existed as a species for roughly 300,000 years. Cities are much younger than that. Farming is younger, writing is younger, even money is younger. Yet somehow a routine followed by billions of people feels like it's always been there. It hasn't. If you could spend one ordinary day with your ancestors from 20,000 years ago, one question might leave both of you completely confused. You ask, "So, what's for lunch?" They'd probably spend a moment trying to understand what you meant, not because they didn't eat. Everyone eats. The confusing part would be the word lunch. A meal expected at a certain time every day would have sounded oddly specific. Their mornings rarely looked the same twice. One sunrise might begin with footprints leading to a herd of antelope. Another might begin with repairing a spear damaged the day before. Some mornings started with an empty stomach. Others started beside the leftovers from a successful hunt. Life moved with the seasons, the weather, and whatever the day happened to bring. The clock on your wall wouldn't have been much help. Mostly because clocks wouldn't exist for a very, very long time. The farther back we travel, the harder it becomes to find anything that resembles our modern routine. That's what makes this story so interesting. 3 meals a day didn't suddenly appear. Nobody gathered the world's population and announced, "From now on, breakfast is at 8." Instead, thousands of years of small changes slowly shaped the routine many of us follow without a second thought. Farmers, emperors, monks, factory workers, school children, each left a small mark on the way we eat today. By the end of this story, breakfast, lunch, and dinner won't seem quite as ordinary anymore, because something as simple as eating 3 meals a day turns out to have a surprisingly long history. And like so many chapters in human history, it began long before anyone had a dining table. For most of human history, nobody planned their day around breakfast. The day simply began. The sun came up, people woke, someone checked the fire, someone else wandered to a nearby stream. Children were already awake, finding ways to entertain themselves long before anyone invented cartoons. The first meal, whenever it happened, depended on something much less predictable than the time. Was there food? Some mornings, the answer was easy. The group still had meat from the day before. A fire had kept it edible overnight, and everyone could eat before heading out again. Other mornings were different. Maybe yesterday's hunt failed. Maybe the berry patch had already been picked clean. Maybe a storm had kept everyone sheltered for 2 days. Those mornings often began with work before food. Finding breakfast wasn't the first task of the day. Finding food was. That difference matters. Even today, researchers studying hunter-gatherer communities notice that meals don't always fit into neat boxes. The Hadza people of northern Tanzania, whose traditional lifestyle has been studied for decades, often eat according to what the day provides rather than following a fixed schedule. Honey collected in the morning, berries found along the way, roasted tubers later in the day, or meat after a successful hunt can all shape when people eat. Their lives aren't a window into the past, but they do remind us that human eating habits can be remarkably flexible. Flexibility was valuable. Food doesn't wear a watch, neither do wild animals. Imagine spotting a herd of antelope just after sunrise. Nobody says, "Let's wait until after breakfast." By the time breakfast is over, the antelope might be somewhere over the next hill. On another day, someone discovers a tree full of ripe fruit while collecting firewood. That wasn't tomorrow's snack. That was today's good luck. Many foods spoiled quickly. If nature handed you something fresh, you usually took advantage of it. That doesn't mean life was completely random. People understood their surroundings better than anyone. They knew where certain plants grew. They remembered when fish returned to the rivers. They learned which trees produced fruit first and which valleys held water during dry seasons. Patterns existed. The calendar was written into the landscape instead of hanging on a kitchen wall. One season brought nuts, another brought migrating animals, another filled the forests with berries. Experience mattered far more than the hour of the day. Even children grew up learning these rhythms, not from books, from watching, from walking, from asking questions. By the time they were old enough to help gather food, many already knew more about the nearby land than most of us know about our own neighborhoods. Meals naturally followed those rhythms. Some days were generous, others demanded patience. Nobody expected every sunrise to end with breakfast, lunch, and dinner waiting in perfect order. For tens of thousands of years, that was simply normal. Then something happened that quietly changed almost everything. People began planting the food they wanted to eat. Instead of waiting for nature to decide what was available, they started making those decisions themselves. And with that, daily life slowly became a little more predictable. So did mealtime. Around 12,000 years ago, in several parts of the world, people began trying something their ancestors had never relied on before. Instead of searching for food every day, they started growing it. Wheat and barley spread across the Fertile Crescent. Rice fields appeared in Asia. Maize would later transform life in the Americas. The change didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen everywhere at once. For thousands of years, farming and hunting existed side by side, but farming introduced something that hunting never could: predictability. If the harvest went well, food could be stored for weeks, sometimes months. Clay jars filled with grain became a kind of prehistoric pantry. You didn't have to wonder whether there would be something to eat tomorrow. That simple idea changed daily life in ways people probably never imagined. The village woke together. Fields needed attention. Animals needed feeding. Grain had to be ground into flour before anyone could bake bread. Suddenly, mornings came with jobs that couldn't simply wait until later. Life slowly began settling into routines, not perfect routines, just more predictable ones. One of the best places to see this change is Çatalhöyük, in what is now Turkey. Around 9,000 years ago, thousands of people lived there in tightly packed mud brick homes. Archaeologists have found grinding stones worn smooth from years of preparing grain, along with ovens and storage bins built right into the houses. Preparing food wasn't just something people squeezed into the day anymore. It had become part of the rhythm of everyday life. Of course, nobody was announcing, "Breakfast is ready." The idea of 3 fixed meals was still a long way off. Different places developed different habits. In ancient Egypt, bread and beer formed the foundation of many meals, especially for workers. Written records show that laborers building royal tombs often received regular food rations throughout the workday. The menu looked very different from ours, but eating was already becoming part of an organized routine. Farther west, the Romans developed routines of their own. Many people began the day with a light bite called ientaculum. Around midday came a simple meal known as prandium. The largest meal usually arrived later in the day, when families gathered for cena. Even then, the schedule wasn't universal. A wealthy senator and a dock worker didn't necessarily eat the same foods or follow the same routine. Meals still depended on occupation, wealth, and local customs. Human history rarely agrees on one way of doing things. One village might eat early because everyone worked the fields. Another might wait until the day's work was finished. One family had enough grain stored for winter. Another hoped next year's harvest would be kinder. Food was becoming more reliable. But it still wasn't following a rule book. That idea would arrive much later, and surprisingly, some people would decide that eating too early in the morning wasn't a very good habit at all. By the Middle Ages, daily life looked very different from that of the first farmers. Towns had grown, markets were busy, church bells echoed across villages, marking the hours long before wristwatches ever existed. Time was beginning to matter in new ways. Oddly enough, breakfast still wasn't guaranteed. In many parts of medieval Europe, healthy adults often waited until later in the day to eat a proper meal. Children, older people, travelers, and anyone doing demanding physical work usually had different routines because their days demanded more energy. There wasn't one rule that everyone followed. If your morning was spent tending sheep, you probably ate differently from someone copying books inside a monastery. If you worked at a blacksmith's forge, your stomach probably had its own opinion. Meals still followed daily life. Daily life didn't follow meals. That pattern lasted for centuries. Then another quiet change arrived. Factories. When the Industrial Revolution spread across Europe and North America, millions of people found themselves working by someone else's schedule. The whistle at the factory wasn't interested in whether you felt hungry. It only cared that work started on time. For perhaps the first time in history, enormous numbers of people began living nearly identical weekdays. Morning, work, a break, more work, home, repeat. Eating gradually slipped into those same spaces. A meal before work helped people get through the morning. A meal during the break kept the day going. Dinner waited until everyone returned home. No single law created breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No inventor patented the three-meal day. It grew out of millions of ordinary routines shared by ordinary people. Schools reinforced it. Factories reinforced it. Offices followed. Even trains helped. A timetable is much easier to organize when passengers expect to eat around similar hours. One small routine quietly encouraged another. By the late 19th century, newspapers were already advertising breakfast foods to busy families. Companies such as Kellogg's later helped turn breakfast into something even more familiar, with cereals marketed as a quick way to begin the day before work or school. It wasn't exactly a worldwide agreement. It was more like a habit that spread, slowly, quietly. One family copied another. One workplace influenced the next. One generation grew up thinking, this is just how people eat. By then, something that had taken thousands of years to develop felt completely ordinary. And that's usually how history works. The biggest changes rarely arrive with a drum roll. They settle into everyday life until nobody remembers a time before them. Tomorrow morning, millions of people will pour coffee, toast bread, or grab something on the way out the door. Very few will stop and wonder why they call it breakfast, or why lunch waits until noon, or why dinner comes after work. Those habits have a history, and that history is still changing. If you skipped breakfast this morning, you probably didn't feel like you were breaking thousands of years of tradition, because you weren't. 3 meals a day isn't a rule written into human biology. It's a routine that fit the lives many people came to live. Even today, the picture isn't nearly as uniform as it first appears. In Spain, dinner often begins long after many families elsewhere have finished washing the dishes. Across parts of the Mediterranean, a larger midday meal has remained an important part of daily life. People working night shifts might eat what feels like breakfast. Just before sunset, someone fasting for religious reasons follows a completely different rhythm for days or even weeks. And plenty of people simply eat whenever their schedule allows. The 3-meal day is common. It has never been universal. Our bodies are surprisingly adaptable. After all, they had hundreds of thousands of years to practice. That flexibility helped our ancestors survive ice ages, droughts, failed hunts, long journeys, and unfamiliar landscapes. It also explains why humans have developed so many different eating traditions around the world. One family gathers around breakfast, another treasures dinner. Some cultures celebrate enormous holiday feasts. Others build their traditions around smaller meals shared throughout the day. Food has always been about more than filling an empty stomach. It's about family, work, celebration, religion, community, routine. Those ideas changed as people changed, and they will probably keep changing. A few hundred years from now, people may look back at our own habits with the same curiosity we have today. Imagine explaining meal prep containers, or eating lunch while staring at a computer screen, or ordering dinner with a phone and having it appear at your front door 20 minutes later. History has a funny way of making today's normal feel tomorrow's mystery. The next time you sit down for breakfast, or rush through lunch, or gather around the dinner table, you're taking part in a routine that wasn't invented by one person or one civilization. It slowly took shape across thousands of years. One harvest, one village, one monastery, one factory, one family at a time. And perhaps that's the most human part of the story. Not the number of meals we eat, but our ability to quietly reshape everyday life, generation after generation, until ordinary habits become traditions, and traditions become things we rarely stop to question. If you enjoyed exploring this chapter of our past, consider subscribing. There are still countless ordinary things in our daily lives with extraordinary histories behind them.